It feels good to be back! Welcome back my viewers to another Hex Maniac Advance tutorial. This is a script tutorial on comparing the process of scripting between XSE and Hex Maniac Advance. So in this video we're going to cover major fundamental differences in scripting between the two softwares, like accessing scripts from the map editor, compiling scripts, and so on. Next we'll cover some shortcuts you can use in Hex Maniac Advance when scripting via the macros. And I'll finish it off with syntactic differences in some of the commands. Quite a few things that I'm going to cover in this tutorial are referenced in more detail in other script tutorials. To access them, click Help and click Event Script Reference. You'll be taken to the GitHub page that covers all of the scripting tutorials that you would need to know when making your own NPCs, map scripts, etc. You can click and read/watch through them at your own leisure. To access other tutorials in Hex Maniac Advance, go back to the HMA window, click Help again, and click Tutorials this time. You'll be brought to a different GitHub page that will have other hyperlinks you can follow. Let the tutorial begin. We will start with the general differences between Hex Maniac Advance and XSE. So in the olden days when people used to ROM hack without Hex Maniac Advance, they would use Advanced Map to look at the maps in conjunction with XSE for scripts. So I'm going to analyze one of the NPCs in Viridian City. In Advanced Map, I have the NPC highlighted and I can click Open Script to go to the script address that I have highlighted. This script would look a lot different in Hex Maniac Advance. At first glance, you'll notice that the script sections are at the top, while text strings are in the middle, and movement instructions are at the bottom. Just like what you would do on Microsoft Word or Notepad, you can edit text strings to make NPCs say something else. Though in XSE, make sure you keep the #org directive and the equal sign, as those are needed to compile strings instead of commands. You can also change the script code, such as using different commands or changing the parameters that are passed in. Some of the substitutions you can use in for numbers, such as last result, will be different in XSE than in HMA. Now, if you want to save your changes and have them reflected in the ROM, do not go to File and click Save nor Save As. You would have to click Compile once you're done. Then ordinarily you would close XSE and clicking No on the dialog box. Here's the thing though, if you add too many commands and make the script larger than it originally was in XSE, or you made something like a text string too long, then XSE will overwrite data, which could corrupt some parts of your ROM. This is why it's not recommended to use XSE to edit existing scripts. If done correctly, making new scripts in XSE shouldn't cause any corruption. To access map scripts in XSE, you would first have to go to the header tab in Advanced Map, and depending on what data was loaded, you might be able to scroll through specific map scripts and click Open Script. Now let's compare everything we covered thus far to HMA. With the same ROM open, I type Viridian City, then click Maps, then Bank 3, and finally open the map that we just looked at in Advanced Map. I can hover over the NPC we just edited and you can see the new change text there, and I can click on her and you can see similar options that were present in Advanced Map, including an option to go to the address that corresponds to her script. Note that for other NPCs with straightforward scripts, you can edit their data without actually going to their script. But don't rely on this. Anyways, back on topic. Here's what the script looks like in Hex Maniac Advance. Everything is handled in one application. And also, things like strings, Pokemon items, and movement instructions are not separated. Instead, these streams of data are encased in braces, or curly brackets, and they show up right underneath the command that requires them. Note the syntax highlighting in Hex Maniac Advance and the differences in some of the names of the arguments passed in and commands. The main difference in Hex Maniac Advance, however, is when you edit scripts or text in scripts, the bytes change instantly, as shown in the Hex Content Viewer to your right. Furthermore, if I want to add more text to an existing string, the text will automatically move itself to free space. And that goes with regular commands too. Thus, when working in Hex Maniac Advance, you don't risk overwriting data. Meanwhile, back in the map editor, you can click Edit Map Header to show the scripts. The map scripts you can see on the bottom left corner. Clicking on the right arrowhead next to the script address takes me to this map script, and you can see what the script looks like in all of its glory. Here's a side comparison with what it would look like in XSE. To make a brand new Overworld script in HMA, I press Ctrl and G and type a free space address. Make sure that the code tool is highlighted and make sure that the code type is set to script. And you can freely type in whatever commands you want, such as lock, face player, and sound. and there are also auto-completion tools to help you. Lastly, I just click the blue save icon to save my changes. In XSE, however, if I wanted to go to another address in the ROM, I would just type that address in the offset text box and click decompile. And in this case, you can see the script here. Note that the sound command has a number for its parameter instead of a sound name. To make a new script within XSE, your first line of code would have to be #dynamic and the address you want to start looking for free space with, followed by #org@start. Then I fill out a couple of commands. Note that the syntax will be a little bit different and we'll cover that later in the video. Anytime you want a pointer to text or other lines of code, you need an @ symbol and another name. There are also different macro names in XSE compared to HMA. For custom text strings, I would have to do #org and the name of the message pointer, and on the next line I would need an equal sign followed by the text. Now I'm done. Now I just click compile to save changes and close out of XSE. But here's a problem, I don't necessarily know what address XSE started compiling to, because 718.240 was already taken. Unless you have a specific setting enabled, you will have to manually figure out where that script compiled to via a hex editor. Luckily, now I can just check the ROM and HMA to find where it is. After poking around for a bit, I found the address, and you can see the new script on the left. In HMA, I can type a circumflex, then grave XSE grave to automatically format the raw bytes as a script. The last difference of note is that in XSE, all numbers are shown as hexadecimals, as noted with the 0x prefix. Whereas in Hex Maniac Advance, there is a mixture of hex numbers, regular decimal numbers, and stuff like Pokemon names and item names that would have been shown as numbers in XSE. Notice the ifCompareGo2 command has an equal sign as one of the parameters, while the corresponding parameter in XSE has to be expressed as a number, requiring more memorization. Also, the pointers look different and flags will always have their numbers expressed as hex numbers. And that's everything. Before moving on, we can do a recap. Alright, here's a recap of what we've covered thus far. Hex Maniac Advance has a map editor and script editor, so accessing NPC scripts and such does not require third-party software, whereas in XSE you would need Advanced Map to access most of the scripts in the game. Some of the things in XSE script editor are different from HMA script editor, mainly how the code is displayed, such as color text and how arguments of commands are rendered. If you are accustomed to using XSE or PokeSieve UI, it may take some time to get used to how HMA formats scripts. When it comes to adding/editing scripts, the changes happen in real time in HMA and not in XSE. For XSE, you would have to compile your changes and pray to God that data does not get overwritten elsewhere. As mentioned earlier, Hex Maniac Advance repoints data to free space as needed, while XSE does not. We can now switch gears to the different ways that Hex Maniac Advance can optimize scripts via shortcuts. I'll admit the split screen between XSE and Hex Maniac Advance looks so terrible. I'm so sorry. Fortunately, the one thing that really matters in Hex Maniac Advance at this point is the script tool, which is on the left panel anyway. Anyways, there is more than a handful of macros in Hex Maniac Advance that take multiple lines of script code and compress them down to one line. I will cover 5 categories of these macros, and I will show you where to find the rest. So the first 2 macros involve the player getting an item. To make either of the 2 following macros in XSE, you would need 2 lines of code that say copy var if not 0, a specific variable number, and then another number at the end. The 0x121 is a random item ID, and the 0x2 on the next line will be the number of items to give. Lastly, you will need a line of code that says call std0 or call std1 depending on which macro you want to replicate. I'll copy and paste these 3 lines of code to highlight the slight difference. It looks like these lines of code have no synergy with each other, and that's okay nowadays. To show you what they look like in Hex Maniac Advance, I'm going to copy and paste these 6 lines of code into the code tool, which I already have configured. Now if I click off and click back onto the script, you'll notice that the 6 lines of code turned into 3 lines. There are 2 macros that give the player 2 TM01s and an automatic end token. The first macro is used for when an NPC gives you an item and does not disappear right away, while the second macro is used for picking up items from Pokeballs in the Overworld. The sprite would just disappear right afterwards. So like if I were to go to the magma hideout, by pressing the house icon, typing magma hideout, and going to the map that I'm thinking of, I'll need to adjust the zoom and all of that because split screening is awful. See this Pokeball? I'm going to go to its script address. And you'll see that the only relevant line of code is the find.item macro. The syntax here makes much more sense than the stuff that you see on the right. The next set of macros I want to talk about involve checking for a specific flag or variable, which come up more often than you may realize. In XSE, if you want to check a flag and then jump to an address if a flag was set or cleared, you would have to write out check flag, then the flag number, which I'll use 0x400 for an example. And this syntax is unique to XSE. You would have to use if, followed by a number to denote a comparison operator, then the word go to or call depending on the permanency of jumping to the address, and then a pointer to the address you want to go to. Instead of using angle brackets, however, you would have to put a 0x8 and then put the address that you want to go to afterwards. More specifically, you have to add the address by 0x8000000. The number 1 after the if means that if the flag was set. If I want to test that if the flag was not set, I would use a 0 instead. In Hex Maniac Advance, you can consolidate all of these bytes into one command line by typing if.flag. And you can see all 4 options that you can autocomplete from. There's both if flag set and if flag clear that we've discussed before, and each one has a go to and a call variant. On the left side of your screen, I will replicate the first lines of code I did in XSE via if.flag.set.goto. For the first parameter, I can click this button to find an unused flag within Hex Maniac Advance, or I can manually type in the flag number I used earlier. As for the pointer parameter, I can now use the brackets for my pointer notation, like you'd see in the Hex Content Viewer. Alternatively, I can do this. I'll type if.flag.clear.call followed by the same flag, and then I can name the pointer section 1 instead of using an address. In the next couple lines, I could type section 1 with a colon and then write code from there. We can do something similar with variables, though the syntax in XSE would be compare the variable number, which I'll use 4OFA for this demonstration, and then a number like 20. Instead of literal numbers for variables, I can use aliases like last result, but for consistency's sake, I'll keep it at 4OFA. Similar to checking the flags, in XSE you would need to use if, number, go to, pointer as the next line of code. For instance, to check if the variable is exactly set to 20, I will use if 0x1 call and then a pointer. In XSE only, if I had a dynamic E3CF64, which is where free space conventionally starts in Overworld, line at the top, followed by #org@start, I can use named pointers similarly to how I'd use them in HMA. Just use an @ symbol followed by the name of choice. Then in a separate block of code, you would do #org, name of the pointer, and then you can follow through with the rest of the code. However, in Hex Maniac Advance, your life can be made easier by doing this. I'm going to type if.compare.call, and you can see some variable aliases already, but I'll stick with 40FA. And then the next parameter is a comparison operator, which does not require a number, but I'll specify one anyways, 4 for less than or equal to. The next parameter is the value parameter, and I can use 20 like what I've been using already. And the last parameter is the pointer. And for this one, I'll pick my own ROM address. If I click off the script and click back on, you'll see that the 4 got changed to the greater than or equal to operator. So for the next few macros, I didn't demonstrate them in XSE because I mixed up which commands were mislabeled. Ironic, huh? I'll show on screen what I'm talking about. Also, Hex Maniac Advance fixes this issue altogether by giving those bottom 2 commands different names. When it comes to checking if a trainer is defeated or not, there are 4 different macros you can use. If I type if.trainer, you will see the 4 options. The ready keyword means that the trainer's flag was never set in memory. Likewise, the defeated keyword means that the trainer's flag has already been set. What we'll accomplish with this line of code is that if Walter, a Route 121 trainer, was defeated for the first time, the code will jump to section 1. After the command macro that's in blue, I will put Walter and then section 1 in angle brackets. And like in the previous examples, I will define the block of code that corresponds to section 1. Instead of using a check gender command, I will just use a msgbox default followed by a release and an end command, which is reasonable to expect from a trainer after being beaten. One other detail with macros like this is that if you were to try to replicate this in XSE with the actual commands that are being ran in the background, you can't even type Walter or something like an item name for other macros. You must use their actual IDs, which prior to Hex Maniac Advance you would need to use a different software to look them up. Let's switch gears from trainers to Overworld NPCs. In XSE, if you want to make an NPC move, you need to start with an apply movement command, followed by the NPC's ID, which you can find in Advanced Map, and also HMA, and then you would use a pointer to movement instructions. Similarly to text, you would have to use #org and then the name of the dynamic pointer. But for movement instructions themselves, you have to use #raw and then a byte. You would need to look online to find the corresponding numbers to the movement instructions you need for your NPCs. XSE also flips you off when you decompile a script that contains NPC movements, however. Those get annotated for you. But that's it. Anyways, back on topic. In XSE, to end a list of movement instructions, you need a #raw 0xfe line of code, which can be easy to forget. Afterward, you would see a wait movement 0 instruction. If you want to move the player, simply put a 255 instead of a valid NPC ID. In Hex Maniac Advance, we have cooler macros, but let me adjust my setup a little bit. What we can do in HMA is type move.npc, follow it up with an NPC ID, and then hitting spacebar auto-completes the auto pointer. And instead of numbers, we can type in movement instructions by their names within the braces. And we have the godly gift of auto-completion. I can do something similar with the move.player macro. What this does is self-explanatory, and I only need to provide a pointer as of the one parameter. Instead of literally moving a character, I have them emote instead. I do this a lot when two NPCs are having an extended conversation. The last thing I want to tiptoe in is trainer battles. And we have a whole bunch of macros for trainer battles in HMA that are relatively new. In the olden days, however, you would have to specify the trainer battle command, then a number from 0 to 12, but usually 0. Next, the ID of the trainer, which I'll use 0xfe for Walter like we've been using earlier, then a parameter that's almost always 0, and then a few pointers depending on the type of battle. By contrast, in the Overworld, if you want to initiate a single battle, you can just type single.battle, and there are multiple variations you can use, depending on highly specific details that may be important to your scripts. For this example, I'll just use the regular one. I can then specify 0xfe or Walter's name, and then I can hit the spacebar for the auto pointers. This is so convenient, isn't it? Within these auto-generated braces, I can type text data for the intro text and the defeat text, and the changes all get compiled synchronously. There are more macros I can cover in Hex Maniac Advance, but this video would get way too long. In the folder that has the executable for HMA, click Resources and open script reference.txt. Inside you'll see a whole lot of macros I didn't touch. You can read this file to understand what they do. Another thing you can do, for example, with this register match call macro, is go back to Hex Maniac Advance, find some empty free space, and then type the name of the macro. The text that shows up includes parameter names that give you clues as to what to specify. So I'm going to specify one of Gentleman Walter's alternate IDs, and this thing just crashed? Well, if that happens to you, click copy a crash message to the clipboard, and then follow one of the report hyperlinks below. As they say, life is full of surprises. Though in this case, I'm pretty sure this bug has been fixed in later versions of Hex Maniac Advance. Compared to Hex Maniac Advance, however, XSE does not have that many macros of its own. By clicking help and then command help, you can scroll all the way down past this dotted line, and here are the few macros that XSE has. You can click an individual one to find more information about it if you're so curious. With that said, if you're transitioning from XSE to Hex Maniac Advance, you'll find these shortcuts and side-by-side comparisons very helpful. There are more fine details about scripting in Hex Maniac Advance that will take some time to get used to, and we have other tutorials for that, including tutorials for usage of auto and sections. Now let's transition to the final objective. Now we can talk about some of the differences in the command names themselves between the two programs. So back in the script reference file, if I scroll down a little bit, you'll see some numbers followed by command names. You will see some commands where the number, in this case 0C, shows up twice. The name on top is what's shown in Hex Maniac Advance, while the name on the bottom is an alias for the command name. Both forms are valid, which can help out XSE users that are used to older versions of command names. And sometimes you can see in the comments that jump ramp is an alternate old name for return ram. Here's another example that we talked about before in objective number 2. XSE calls command number 1 a copy var if not 0, but that command doesn't actually do that. So in HMA, we actually call the command set or copy var to match what it says in the source code. As we saw a couple of minutes ago, you can use copy var if not 0 and HMA will compile the command correctly. But when you decompile scripts in Hex Maniac Advance, you will see set or copy var instead. There are some command names that are completely different in Hex Maniac Advance that don't have alternate forms from older script editors. To find a full list of differences, I'll show you where to make the comparisons later on. But for now, we'll cover more differences in command names. I've spent so much time recording Pokemon Showdown that I missed so many Hex Maniac Advance versions. Anyways, the first command of note is actually a macro, which we didn't cover in the other objective, but is still worth mentioning. It's the one that creates text boxes on screen, that we use all the time. In XSE, I hope the split screen looks better. To make a message box, you would type the macro message box, msgbox, and then you specify a pointer to memory. And I'll pick an address you can already see in Hex Maniac Advance's Hex Content Viewer. Once again, I put a 0x8 before the address, so that the emulator reads from the ROM instead of BIOS data. And now the message type. There are 5 valid names you can put, and they correspond to the numbers 2 through 6. All of them start with capital MSG and a low line. I'm going to do some copying and pasting to show you the 5 different ones. They are face, sign, keep open, yes, no, and normal. Note that for this you cannot actually use the syntax in Hex Maniac Advance's code tool whatsoever. So I'll just rewrite with Hex Maniac Advance's accepted syntax. Since messagebox is also a macro in Hex Maniac Advance, I will type messagebox dot, and you can see a whole lot of options pop up. Some of them don't correspond to anything in XSE. Nevertheless, I will start by typing NPC, then I replace the auto pointer with a hand-picked address that will put the text string out of the way. Notice that I only need 1 parameter instead of 2. I will now copy and paste this line several times. Sign is unchanged. Keep open is actually default in Hex Maniac Advance. Yes, no stays the same. And lastly, normal is rendered as auto close instead. Notice that each macro is 8 bytes long, and the only difference between all of them is that the last byte is a different number. I will shortly show on screen what each message box macro does. Another big difference between the two programs is if statements. We talked about these briefly when it came to the if compare and if flag set macros and stuff like that, but we'll dive a little further. So let's say in XSE you had a compare statement like compare 8014 and we'll pick the number 5. Afterwards on the next line you would use if, and then you would need a comparison operator which must be expressed as a number between 0 and 5. For instance, I can type 0x1 to check if variable 8014 equals 5. And then I type go to or call. And I follow this up with a pointer to another ROM address. Alternatively, I can repeat this setup, but replace the 2 after if with 1 to check if variable 8014 is greater than 5. And if the condition is correct, I can go to a different address in memory. In HMA, we can use the if compare go to macro, but that's besides the point. So in XSE, I have this line that says if 2 go to and a pointer. I would express this in HMA as if 1 with no spaces, and then I can satisfy a comparison operator from this list. Here I'll click equals, and I'll make a sample pointer to 319880. Notice that Hex Maniac Advance actually made another box for code at that address. Now if I want code at a pointer to be called instead of gone to, I would use if2 instead. So I type if2 and then I can type a number for a condition instead of an algebraic symbol. So I use the number 2 and then I can select another pointer. The pointer I'm going to choose isn't really going to make a lot of sense because it will cause these two blocks of code on screen to run infinitely if both conditions are met. But I'm not going to be running these statements in an actual game. And the point here is just to highlight the syntactic differences between these commands. If you're using modern versions of Hex Maniac Advance, however, it's unlikely that you'll need if1 or if2 on its own, because we have a lot of macros that combine other commands with if1 and if2, like if.compare, etc. There's another command called gettime that stores information about the time into 3 variables. However, in XSE, it's incorrectly called resetVars. I think it was because this command was tested only in fire red and leaf green, where there's really no clock. I remember when I used to make scripts in XSE, I figured this out the hard way. There's a command called setPokemonPP that has you pick a Pokemon based on the position in the party, so 0 would be the first one and 5 would be the last one. And then I would specify a move slot, so 3 would be the 4th move. And for the PP amount argument, I'll just use the number 2. However, this command name is very misleading. In HMA, this command is actually called setmonmove. Just like with the example in XSE, I use 0 for the Pokemon slot, 3 for the move slot, and I specified 2 earlier, but since it's asking for a move name instead of just a regular number, it would have actually taught my Pokemon Karate Chop. Here's another change between XSE and HMA. In Pokemon Emerald, if you want an NPC to sell you decorations, you need to use Pokemart 2 followed by a pointer to decorations. Here I'll just use a pointer to the start of free space in Emerald. The other command, Pokemart 3, is very similar, but there are minor differences in dialogues, and neither of these commands are valid in HMA. The name HMA uses for this command is decorationmart. As for the pointer to the products, you can use auto and fill in decorations between braces as you please. Pokemart 3's version in HMA is decorationmart 2, and it works almost identically to the first one. There was another thing I mentioned earlier. If I go to XSE's command help and filter for set trainer flag, the names of this command and the previous command are actually mixed up with each other. 61 should have said set trainer flag, and 62 should have said clear trainer flag. HMA resolves this by using entirely different names for these two commands. For command number 61, we have defeatedtrainer, and I'll specify the trainer name Sawyer, and the command after it is readytrainer, which I'll specify Walter 3, or Walter's second rematch trainer ID. So in this case, Sawyer's trainer flag is set in memory, while one of Walter's trainer flags is cleared, and this specific trainer slot can be matched again. The last thing I want to cover is that if you scroll down the command help list of commands, in XSE you'll notice some slots that say CMD followed by an ID, which indicate that they are placeholder names. So we have things like CMD96 and CMDC3. If you click on most of them, you'll be given a generic placeholder description for the command. HMA is more up to date when it comes to finding names for every command that's available, though in the script reference file you'll still see some things like nupb1 and nupb2. However, beside them you'll see valid command names that have the same numeric ID. Some of the slots have valid IDs in certain games, and most of the command descriptions are set in stone. As you ease into the transition from scripting in XSE to scripting in HMA, you can have this script reference.txt file and XSE's command help side by side to be more familiar with every command and how they are to be expressed in Hex Maniac Advance. In addition to the macros, you can just have a test ROM open in Hex Maniac Advance, and you can just write sample scripts with these commands to get some valuable practice. And that's everything. You have learned some history about how XSE works when it comes to dealing with overworld scripts, as well as some differences in commands and macros between XSE and Hex Maniac Advance. There are other contrasts in HMA's script editor which are explored more in other scripting tutorials that you can find on Hex Maniac Advance's GitHub. Those tutorials can help with getting accustomed to writing scripts in HMA after coming from a background in XSE scripting. Hopefully I can release another Hex Maniac Advance tutorial during Christmas break, but I cannot keep a promise. Nevertheless, I hope you all liked this video. We have a Discord server that is open to all HMA users, and you can join to interact with our community. Instead of a Christmas carol, I'll finish with a gym leader theme.